What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. We are about 24 hours away from the NFL draft, at least the first round of the NFL draft, so I am super excited for that. Hopefully, my Minnesota Vikings get a chance to move up and take our quarterback of the future in either Drake Maye or JJ McCarthy. That's what I'm hoping for. Let me know what you want your NFL team to do during the NFL draft in the comments down below. But today we're here for our final pre-draft rankings. I got my top 36 players for you guys as prospect profiles, not accounting for the landing spots in the draft capital. Obviously, that may change some things, but let's talk about these guys as prospects, and we will look at this from a surface level because you guys know, if you've been following the channel for a long time, we have talked in depth about all of these prospects up to this point. So we're going to look at this from a surface level. We'll talk about the tier breaks in these prospects for me, discuss some of the guys who have been rising and falling in my rankings as we approach the NFL draft over the last couple of months, and also what I am going to need to see in the NFL draft for some of these guys to move in my rankings. So with that being said, let's not waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about my first tier. So you guys see we have the tier maker pulled up on the screen right now for you guys so you guys can follow along. But we're going to start from the top, work our way all the way down to the bottom, working from the number 1 player to the 36th. So with that being said, let's just hop into tier 1. We don't got to talk about these prospects for too long, but it is going to be Caleb Williams, who's coming in as my quarterback 1 in this class, and Marvin Harrison Jr., who is my wide receiver 1 in this class. These guys are going to be very good. I expect them to be elite Dynasty fantasy football assets for a very long time for your rosters. They are penciled in as the 101 and the 102 in my rankings. And outside of that, everybody has talked about these guys for a long period of time. I said we don't got to talk about them too much today. This is the top tier, and for sure my top 2 players in this class. Now moving on to the tier 2, let's talk about these players. I have Drake Maye right now as my QB2, Jayden Daniels as my QB3, Malik Nabers as my wide receiver 2, and Odunze as my wide receiver 3. Now this tier is filled with high-end NFL star type of caliber players. I think all of these guys are going to be very good for your fantasy football teams. And honestly, this tier feels incredible because if you're sitting at the 106, which is going to be the end of this tier, and you're getting a Drake Maye, you're getting a Odunze, a Malik Nabers, a Jayden Daniels, if you get one of those players at the 106, you are most likely getting a difference maker in the middle of your first round, which is not very common. That's just a testament to how good this class is. And now Drake Maye currently sits as my QB2. Him and Jayden Daniels, I think, are going to be interchangeable. I think the landing spot, the draft capital, everything in between is going to organize these two guys for me in my final rankings after the NFL draft. But right now, as a prospect, I like Drake Maye just a tiny bit better than I like Jayden Daniels. But like I said, that could change depending on their landing spots. And you also have Malik Nabers and Odunze here. That's not necessarily the same for these guys. I love Odunze. I think he is a stud wide receiver prospect, but I have had Malik Nabers as my number 2 for the majority of this pre-draft process, and I expect that to remain the same unless there is a drastic shift in landing spots. For example, Malik Nabers gets a very, very bad landing spot and Odunze gets a very, very good landing spot. That could switch them, but it's going to have to take something drastic. For the most part, it is going to be Malik Nabers for me as the wide receiver 2 and Odunze as the wide receiver 3. Now moving on to my tier 3, I have 3 players in this tier. First one is going to be JJ McCarthy. He comes in as my QB4 in this class. We also have Brock Bowers, who is going to come in as my tight end 1 in the class, and I am going to throw Brian Thomas Jr. in this tier, coming in as my wide receiver 4 in the class. Now JJ McCarthy, he's been a consistent riser for the majority of the Dynasty fantasy football community and even the NFL draft community over the course of the offseason. I think it's almost certain that this is a guy who's going to get top 10 NFL draft capital, maybe even top 5 depending on the circumstances. And if he gets in a landing spot like Minnesota, like we talked about at the beginning of this episode, I think that is going to increase his dynasty value tremendously. And even though he may not be viewed as a similar prospect to the guys in the tier above in Drake Maye and Jayden Daniels, I think there is a massive gap between JJ McCarthy and the next quarterbacks in our rankings, which almost puts McCarthy here in a tier of his own at the quarterback position. Then moving on to Brock Bowers, he has obviously been the locked and loaded tight end 1 in this class for multiple years now, it seems. I don't expect that to change. This is a guy who's going to get the draft capital you want, and I think he's going to be a difference maker for your team early on. And then Brian Thomas Jr., he finds himself in this tier with me as well. I feel like he has separated himself from the rest of the pack. We obviously have the big 3 wide receivers, and then I think it's Brian Thomas Jr. in a tier of his own, and then you have a bunch of other wide receivers after that. But BTJ, he seems to have separated himself, and I think he is a locked and loaded top 9 pick in your Dynasty Fantasy Football leagues. Assuming you're playing in Superflex, you probably should be playing in Superflex if you're not playing in Superflex. But I think he's the locked and loaded bona fide wide receiver 4 in this class, at least as a prospect. But I really don't expect landing spots to change that either. This is a guy who's going to remain in my tier 3. Now moving on to my tier 4, we have a little bit of a larger tier here. And this tier is going to consist of Adonai Mitchell, who's coming in as my wide receiver 5, Lad McConkey, who is coming in as my wide receiver 6, Xavier Worthy coming in as my wide receiver 7, Troy Franklin as my wide receiver 8, and also Jonathan Brooks, who is my RB1, and Trey Benson, who is my RB2. I think all of these guys belong in this tier 4. And honestly, I love this tier of players. This is a true testament to how deep this class is because you look at the types of guys that you can draft here. Mitchell, McConkey, Worthy, Franklin, Brooks, Benson. And when you're looking at it from a pick standpoint, in your 12-man leagues, these are 15 prospects into the draft. So you're looking at the 203 here for the last guy. Being able to get a guy like that at the 203 is truly a testament to how good this class is. But I think the big thing about this tier is you have a big cluster of wide receivers here. And I think all of these wide receivers bring traits that are going to benefit NFL offenses. All of them kind of have a little bit of different skill sets, but also I think all of these guys have a tiny question mark or two on their profile as well, which could lead to a little bit of uncertainty depending on the situation. Now, the order that it sits in right now is what I have come to the conclusion with for my pre-draft rankings. I fully expect landing spot, draft capital, scheme, opportunity in year 1, all of those variables to probably rearrange this tier for me as far as these wide receivers go. And I will cover that shortly after the NFL draft. I will give you guys updated rankings for these players in each and every positional group right after the NFL draft. So you guys will see how we react to the landing spots. And when you look at this list, a faller for me in this cycle has been Troy Franklin, and he hasn't necessarily done anything wrong. But I think so far, all of the signs that are pointing to Troy Franklin's draft capital mean that he's not going to be a guy who falls on day 1. Most likely a guy who's going to fall on day 2 and hopefully in that second round. But I think that there are some question marks about his profile. I wouldn't be surprised if he's a round 2 wide receiver. That is probably the most likely range. But I think he's been a slight faller for me in my rankings. And you guys know I was a big fan of Troy Franklin early in the process. But on the opposite end, Adonai Mitchell has been a big riser for me. A guy that I didn't necessarily have as a first round rookie pick type of wide receiver. But now as we are approaching the NFL draft, this is a guy who has found his way into the back half of my first rounds, and at worst an early second round pick. So those guys have kind of moved a little bit for me in this tier. But moving on to the running backs in this tier, I think both of these guys deserve to be in this tier because if these guys land in favorable situations, we could be looking at these guys as first round picks. And some of those favorable situations would be Dallas or the Chargers in the second round. I think that would be ideal for either of these guys. They also both have 3 down back potential. Obviously, Jonathan Brooks has some question marks about the ACL, but it hasn't seemed to hinder his draft process so far. I think if those guys get those types of landing spots, we could be considering them as early as the first couple of players in this tier of guys. And right there in the conversation with Brian Thomas Jr., assuming that they get that type of landing spot. But these 2 guys are my 1 and 2 running backs in this class in a tier of their own. Now moving on to my tier 5, this is our next tier. I do have Bo Nix in here as my quarterback 5, Michael Penix Jr. as my quarterback 6, Blake Corum as my running back 3 in the class, Ricky Pearsall as my wide receiver 9 in the class, and MarShawn Lloyd as my running back 4 in this class. Now this is the first tier where I feel like landing spot and draft capital are going to answer a lot of the question marks. I think everything above this tier feels pretty solid for me, where no matter the landing spot, no matter the draft capital, unless something very drastic changes, those guys all feel like they are going to stay in a somewhat similar range. Now, starting in this tier, I think this is where the draft capital is a little bit harder to project, and so I will be holding the draft capital in the landing spot with a little bit more weight than I do for the guys above. But looking at the quarterbacks in this tier, Nix and Penix, they come in together in the same group for me. I do have Nix just slightly above Michael Penix as a prospect, and I expect that to remain the same unless, like we said, something crazy happens where these guys are drafted a round apart. Maybe Penix goes in the first round and Nix is a second round quarterback. That's where we probably make that change in the rankings. And looking at Blake Corum, this is a guy who has been consistently my running back 3 in this class. Now, I used to have him in the same tier as Trey Benson and Jonathan Brooks, but the more that I've thought about it, the more that I've gotten into these rankings, the more I feel like there is a little bit more need for Blake Corum to fall into a favorable scheme-dependent option. Now, obviously, if he reunites with Jim Harbaugh in Los Angeles, that is like the gold mine landing spot for Blake Corum. He could definitely move up a tier and go back with those guys, but he does feel like he is a little bit more scheme dependent than those other two guys. Those guys feel like they can find roles in almost any offense in the NFL. I don't know if Blake Corum can do the same, but this is a super hyper talented running back. He is so efficient with the ball in his hands. I love everything about his tape. I just think he is a little bit more scheme dependent. So he does fall here in the tier 5, but still my running back 3 in the class. And then lastly, we look at Pearsall and MarShawn Lloyd here in this tier. I think both of these guys are very talented players. I think they will be contributors on your Dynasty Fantasy Football rosters, assuming that they land in the right NFL offense, the right situation. But I think the draft capital is still a little bit harder to project for these guys, especially for MarShawn Lloyd. I don't necessarily know where the NFL is on MarShawn Lloyd, but the talent speaks for itself. I kind of want to see where those guys go. And Pearsall, he's been a steady riser for me during this draft process as well. A guy who's found himself into my top 10 wide receivers, officially in as my pre-draft wide receiver 9. But let's see what happens with the landing spots for these guys, and let's see how we are going to react to those landing spots in our post-draft rankings. Now moving on to my tier 6. Here's where we are going to have Jaylen Wright, who comes in as my running back 5, Keon Coleman as my wide receiver 10, Malachi Corley as my wide receiver 11, Xavier Legette as my wide receiver 12, Jermaine Burton as my wide receiver 13, and Roman Wilson as my wide receiver 14. Now I'm sure this is going to make some people angry. A lot of people love Roman Wilson, especially after the Senior Bowl. He falls in as my wide receiver 14, but let's talk about the tier here with all of these wide receivers. This is a tier here that, sure, they all have talent. I think they all could bring certain skill sets to NFL offenses, but they all feel like they are going to need to fall into the right NFL scheme for them to be fantasy football relevant. Every single one of these guys, for the most part, Coleman, Corley, Legette, Wilson, they all feel like they need to find themselves into a slot role in the NFL with the right NFL coach. And if they do that, they can be successful. But I think specifically Coleman, Legette, due to their size, if they get to a situation where they're forced to play outside, or maybe they don't get into the right type of role in this offense, I think it could get very messy very quickly. So there is a lot of risk with all of these players in this tier. And then even looking at Jaylen Wright, the running back in this tier as well. This is a guy who is a very talented rusher, but I think he has some pass catching question marks. There are some concerns for that. He obviously is going to need to get the draft capital that we want to see out of those running backs. And then obviously with running backs, you need to fall into a spot where you will get opportunity early on. The biggest riser in this tier for me, and it has happened kind of late in this pre-draft process, but it is Jermaine Burton. Jermaine Burton is a very, very talented wide receiver. If you look at Matt Harmon's reception perception, he graded out very, very good, which made me have to go back and rewatch the tape. He is a very, very talented player. The only issue with Jermaine Burton is he has a lot of character concerns. There are a lot of off the field issues with this guy. And so I think because of that, we may not see the draft capital that we want to see out of a player like Jermaine Burton. But with that being said, this is a guy who you might be drafting just as a bet on the talent, maybe not necessarily a bet on the person, a bet on the situation. But this is a guy who is very talented. It's just going to have to take a lot of things for him to get it right. He's going to have to get in there with the right coach, the right locker room, the right culture, and help him get that back on track, because the talent speaks for itself with Jermaine Burton. And I do like what I see on the tape for Jermaine Burton, and he's definitely a guy that I'm going to be throwing some darts at in the late rounds of my rookie drafts here in the next week or so. Now let's move on to tier 7. Who I have in this tier is going to be Jatavian Sanders, who comes in as my tight end 2. I also have Spencer Rattler as my quarterback 7, Braelon Allen as my RB 6, Will Shipley as my RB 7, Jaylen Polk as my wide receiver 15, and Javon Baker as my wide receiver 16. Now there's still some talented players in this tier, but by no means is anybody in this tier a sure thing for our fantasy football rosters. If I had to make a bet, I would say that Rattler and Sanders are the most likely to see an increase in their value, and they are probably the most likely to give you a good ROI, especially if they land in the right situations. Now, I've come down a little bit on Jatavian Sanders over the last couple of months, and it's really no fault to Sanders. He hasn't done anything negative throughout the draft process. There's nothing that I've seen on the tape that I dislike. I think it's just more that over the last couple of months, we've dug deeper into the prospects. There's guys who I've gotten a little bit higher on, and by default, JT Sanders has fallen down the board just a tiny bit, but this is still a very talented player, and in your tight end premium leagues, he's still going to be a benefit to your rosters. I expect him to get day 2 draft capital at the worst, and he's definitely worth taking an upside shot on. And then looking at Spencer Rattler, this is a guy who I expect to be drafted on day 2 as well. He's probably a 3rd round. I've even heard rumblings of a late 2nd round quarterback pick, depending on the situation. You obviously want him to go somewhere where there's a little bit of an older veteran, or maybe an ambiguous quarterback room where he could probably find some playing time here early early on in his career, but the talent of Spencer Rattler speaks for itself, obviously going back to his high school days and his days at Oklahoma, and then finishing it up there at South Carolina. A very talented player, but definitely worth a gamble in these rounds as well. And then with these running backs, both of these guys were Debbie darlings early on in their career. Braelon Allen, Will Shipley, very early producers in their college careers. I think they're very talented players, but obviously at this point, the draft capital and the landing spot is going to have to play a role, and I don't necessarily think that these guys are locked and loaded into first or second round capital. So third, fourth, fifth, that's probably the range that these guys go in, and that's going to kind of organize how we view them and change how we view them depending on that. And then Polk and Baker, I think both of these wide receiver prospects are good wide receivers. They have NFL traits. They could be starters at the next level. I just don't know how beneficial they will be to your fantasy football teams, unless, of course, they're in the right situation. But both of these guys are very good receivers, and they're probably worthy of a third-round pick in your rookie drafts. And now moving on to my tier 8, this is where we're going to conclude the top 36. I have Jaylen McMillan, who is my wide receiver 17, Malik Washington, my wide receiver 18, Ray Davis, my running back 8, and Bucky Irving, my running back 9. And there's probably a lot more players that could be in this tier. But like we said, for the sake of the video, we're only going through 36 prospects. So these guys are at the top of this tier for me. They conclude the top 36. Jaylen McMillan is a player that I think can fit into an NFL offense. I think he is a slot-only type of wide receiver. I think there's a couple situations that could be good for Jaylen McMillan that would make me feel better about him as a prospect. And I think the best situation for Jaylen McMillan that I have thought about is, what if Jaylen McMillan goes and plays in Cincinnati? He takes over that slot role, taking it from Tyler Boyd, who is obviously a free agent at this point, and he gets to play that slot there for Joe Burrow and the Bengals. I think that would be an awesome situation for Jaylen McMillan. I would love that for his dynasty stock, but he seems more of a slot-only type of wide receiver at the NFL. Now, Malik Washington, this is a player who passes the eyeball test. Obviously, size is a concern, so we'll see how the NFL reacts to that and shows us how much they value him with the draft capital that he gets. Also, if you guys have been watching these videos early on in the offseason, you know I liked Ray Davis a lot early on. This is also a guy who has kind of come down in my rankings. Still a very talented player, but not a guy who I think is a top 5, top 6 type of running back in this class anymore. And I don't necessarily think this is a guy who's going to be able to go to a situation in the NFL and compete for starting reps immediately. I think the same thing can be said for Bucky Irving as well out of Oregon. Both of these guys are guys that I expect to be drafted on day 3, meaning that they're going to be drafted somewhere between that 4th and that 7th round. And the way that we will react to them moving forward after the NFL draft will be dependent on where they are drafted and the situation that they get drafted to. Obviously, we want these guys to have opportunity to earn some touches, to prove themselves early on in their career. So we will be keeping an eye out for that in the NFL draft. Now, that is all I have for you guys today. Like I said, the NFL draft is tomorrow, so hopefully you guys are excited. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, let me know what you want your NFL team to do in the NFL draft down below. I want my team to go get Drake Maye or JJ McCarthy. And if you like this video, go ahead and hit that like button for us. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. Also, make sure you guys are subscribed to this channel and hitting that notification bell. That way you see these updated post NFL draft rankings when they come out later next week. And last but not least, make sure you are a member of our free Discord. I do have a free Discord. It is linked in the description. We are going to be doing some rookie mock drafts with some subscribers after the 7th round of the NFL draft. It is going to be on Sunday for a live stream for Let's Talk Dynasty. So make sure you guys are members of the Discord. That way you guys can participate in those rookie mocks with us. And with all of that out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.